This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
Welcome to our studies in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Like all the rest of the scriptures, it's a very beautiful section. It has a lot of history in it. It has several lessons in it for us to learn. I am your instructor. My name is Chuck Horner, as you saw there ahead of you. I'll be using the New King James Version of the Bible, specifically because it's easier to read throughout the world, not just here in the United States. The Book of Kings, the Book of Kings. It takes up the history of the kingdom from David's last days and follow it to its collapse at the time of the Babylonian exile. Now I want to take a moment here and just talk about this a little bit. The books of Kings and the books of Samuel were together in the original way, and it was called the books of kingdoms, as we'll see here later. But they were, as we say, one book through, and then Chronicles was another set. But here's the thing I want you to understand, that as we go through now, Chronicles is not going to be studied separately. I say again, it is not going to be studied separately. We're going to do it as what we call a synoptic. In other words, where Chronicles and Kings match, we will not study the Chronicles part. We'll only study those when we come up with information that is different or adds to, I should say, what we have in Kings. Because most of it is, in a way, a repetition. And so we will not be studying them as 4 books, but really as 2, bringing in the Chronicles information. All right, now let's go on with our introduction. The purpose of this record is not primarily to write down the history of the period. These books demonstrate that God blesses those who obey Him and punishes those who defy Him. That is important. If you don't learn anything else, learn that. This book demonstrates that God blesses those who obey Him and punishes those who disobey. That's no different than it is to today. But this book demonstrates that very, very clearly. This is one of the major lessons that we get from the book. We'll cover another one in a little bit, but this is very important that you realize this. Now, the Hebrew text itself for this material is Kings, is its subject of both Judah and Israel. The nation, as we will see, divided into 2 kingdoms when Solomon died about 930 BC. The northern kingdom, Israel, had 10 tribes and is sometimes called by its leading tribe's name, that is Ephraim. The southern kingdom, Judah, had 2 tribes. Now that would be both of Judah and of Benjamin. They will have those 2 tribes in it. Now, the northern kingdom had 9 dynasties and 20 kings. But the southern kingdom only had 1 dynasty, that's David's, but also had 20 kings. It's amazing that both had 20 kings, even though the southern kingdom lasts much longer than the northern kingdom. And again, the southern one is called Judah, and the northern one is called Israel or Ephraim, depending upon whichever way the chronicler or the writer of the Kings designates them. But we need to understand that they will call them by either name. Israel, incidentally now, did not have one righteous king. Is that not sad? Did not have one righteous king. However, 8 kings in Judah received some degree of praise. Total? No, don't hear me saying that. Not 8 receiving total praise from the Lord, but some degree of praise from the Lord. That's quite a difference, isn't it? Here you have 20 kings in both sets, And you don't have a single good king in the northern set in Israel. That's really sad. They really, really went off into apostasy immediately. Just immediately. The books now cover about 400 years of Hebrew history. Now, like 1st and 2nd Samuel, these books, as I said before, were originally one book in the Hebrew Bible. The present division originated in the Septuagint. Now, do you remember that's when the Old Testament scriptures were translated into Greek by 70 scholars. So when these designations came about at that time. In the Septuagint, then, Samuel and Kings were regarded as continuous history, and they are. They were regarded as continuous history, and they were called the books of the kingdom, and they were divided into 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Kings. So the designations were just a little bit different than what we're accustomed to in the English Bible. How about the writer? We know who the author is. That's God. He inspired the Word. But who is the human author? We really don't know for sure. We are not positive about who is the human writer. Now, the Talmud says that Jeremiah, now this is a quote here, Jeremiah wrote this book, the Book of Kings and Lamentations. And so there is at least some history in the belief that Jeremiah is the writer. And there are resemblances between the writings of these books and the book of Jeremiah. Now then, we can look at, as I have here on the screen for you, we could compare 2 Kings chapter 24 verses 18 through 25 with the book of Jeremiah chapter 52, the first 34 verses. And so, as I said, there are quite a few resemblances between these books and Jeremiah's writings. Now, Jeremiah was a contemporary of Josiah and the remaining kings of Judah to the time of the exile. And this is obvious when you read Jeremiah and Lamentations. Obviously, when you read, as I said, the books and you look at Lamentations, this covers the period after the exile had started. And Jeremiah looks back over that city and he looks over the people and he says, oh, how sad it is. So he was a contemporary in this historical period, and he could have very easily written it. Yet, however, the events at the end of 2 Kings were evidently written by someone in Babylon. But my friends, Jeremiah was taken to Egypt after the fall of Judah. We see this in Jeremiah 43, the first 7 verses. And so the book itself may have been written by a contemporary then of Jeremiah. But as I said at the very beginning when we started out about the author, we do not know who the author is as far as the human writer is concerned. But that really doesn't make any difference to us because it is Scripture. It is God's Word, and there are many lessons for us to learn as we go through here. Now then, how about the date of the book? Can we give some reasonable accuracy to it? This we can. We can give accuracy to it. The release now of Jeremiah occurred about 562 BC. But the book does not refer to the Jews being permitted to return home by Cyrus in 536. So this gives us a bracket. It was written sometime then between 562 and 536 BC. So we have a pretty good bracket. We have a fairly good idea about the time of the writing, even though we might not know who the human writer was. Now, some of the sources that are used in the books are named. For instance, the Book of the Words of Solomon is mentioned. The books of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah is also mentioned, and the Book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. Excuse me. And so there are references to other writings also. But now we get down to what is the message now of the book of Kings. The books attempt to show that the fate of Israel depended on their observance of the Lord's covenant with them. This is important. Read it again. The books attempt to show the fate of Israel depended on their observance of the Lord's covenant with them. Now, of course, this would be both Israel and Judah in the breakup, but it depended upon their obedience. Now, the tone of the book, it is not of a dispassionate historian. This person seems to really be involved with the things that are happening and is writing down history that is very, very personal to him. And it is very clearly prophetic in nature. Now, we're coming upon our next major point as we go through here. Listen carefully. The reign of each king is assessed not according to his political or historical significance, but according to his spiritual life. Now, you have Azariah, for instance, or Uzziah, we call him sometimes. He ruled Judah for 50 years and appears to have been powerful and prosperous. But the record only gives him 7 verses. And so here is a good example. It doesn't really depend upon the time or the strength or their social or political or economic rule. What is the measure? The measure is how they responded and obeyed God's word. This is the thing that's important all the way through. And so when we have little sides, we'll call them stories for lack of another word, when you have little side stories going through, such as the prophets and things like this, these are all things to show us that this is the measure of a man, this is the measure of a king, this is the measure of a nation. How we obey Jehovah, a very important thing. How about the kings now of Judah and Israel? The books are constructed so as to allow the telling of the stories of the two nations at the very same time. The writer, he jumps back and forth between the kings of Judah and Israel. However, he does stay roughly in the same historical period when he does make these transitions. We will see, if you observe carefully, a pattern is followed in presenting the kings. First, a pattern or an introduction by set form is given. And then, after that, specified events of the ruler's life and reign are stated. Then comes the verdict. It is passed on his reign, and obviously then a conclusion is given again in a set form. And so you can see that we come through this, but the pattern is generally the same as we cover the kings. But what is the most important thing again? How did the king, how did the nation respond to Jehovah? That's the key. That's the thing that we have to keep before us at all times as we study these books. It is how the people, how the king as their leader, how the nation as a whole obeyed Jehovah. And really, when you look back at the prophets and you look at all the others that go along with this in this time period, this is the measure. This is the measure constantly. I've heard the phrase used, we have the golden age of the prophets. Well, what was the job of a prophet? A prophet was to call people back to the Word of God. So if you have a golden age of prophets, that means you've got a black age in the people or the nation or the king, that they have wandered from Jehovah. And so the prophets have to call them back. So they call it the golden age of the prophets. I think it is the black age of the nation. A whole different thing, because that's the only reason the prophets were there, was because they were wandering from God's way. We also see in here the importance of marriage after Jehovah's design. God has always willed that marriage be for one man and one woman for life. Yet, what do we have all the way through here? Polygamy was practiced throughout the Old Testament period. I want you to notice it was never commanded and it was never encouraged. In fact, the Bible goes to great lengths to show the difficulties which arise from it. Specific warnings are given to the kings about imitating the Oriental rulers and taking many wives. Well, let's get back and be a little more specific here. Solomon's polygamy was the beginning of the end of a united Israel. When God's original ideal for marriage is set aside, the result is disaster. And my friends, it's no different here in this time as it is here in our time today. It is exactly the same. When you see a society pushing down marriage and putting it aside and going for alternate lifestyles or whatever you want to call it, you see society being degraded. You see the society going away from God, and you are going to see destruction come. This is the pattern all the way from the beginning. So you see, it's very important that we obey God's marriage laws. So important. And that's why we need to really, really teach our people, teach everybody around us God's laws on marriage. For if those are kept, then a nation usually stays close to Jehovah. That's right. Because we have godly homes, we have godly training in the children, we have a godly nation as a result. But when we go away from God's standard in marriage, everything else is downhill right along with it. Now then, I want to look at the curse now of polygamy. What is it? Well, under the curse of polygamy, the joy of love and the peace of the family are blighted. In that condition, man gives up the sweetest sources of earthly blessings for the very lowest gratifications of animal sensuousness. Love, when it is pure and true, gilds the life of a man with joy of heaven and fills it with the breath of paradise. It renders it more perfect and more noble by the union of two souls and fulfills the original purpose of creation. Friends, a home blessed by life's most natural sanctities becomes a saving ark in the days of storm. And is that not true? I look around and I see friends, I see family that have breakups in their marriages and all of the problems that are there. And yet there are in our families also those that have stayed married for years and years and years. And there's such a difference in those people. I'm very thankful. My wife and I have been together for 47 years. And I look at things like this and I see how true it is. What a blessing it is to remain faithful, to have a faithful spouse, and to follow God's will. Things are just so much different in life. They're so much better. I would not want any part of the lives that I see in my own family that are torn apart because they do not observe God's marriage laws. Let's look now at the women in Eastern homes. They were idle, they were ignorant, they were uneducated, they were degraded, they were intriguing creatures with nothing to think about but gossip, scandal, spite, and animal passion. My friends, they hated the other wives worst of all, and each engaged in the fierce attempt to reign supreme in the affection of the husband, in which she could not monopolize. Oh, you think about the Oriental families around them at this time. You think and look and see the patterns that were there and how degraded their societies were, but yet here in Israel, when they followed it and they went after God's plan, it was such a blessing to the individuals and the nation. But polygamy itself produces horrible results in its children. Murderous rivalry often reigns between them, and fraternal affection is just almost unknown. The children grew up just like their deteriorated mothers. Now listen carefully. The sons of different mothers burned with the mutual animosity of the harem under which their influence had been while they were being brought up. Now these ladies, they were constantly contending for the love and the attention of the husband, the man. All of these were. And you look at David, you look at Solomon now, and how they would build houses for their different families, and really that's what it turns out to be. And look at David's children, the rivalry between them. It's just terrible. And you can usually see it as one mother as opposed to another mother, their children against these children. And they're raised really to think just like the ladies in the harem thought, and to fight like they fought, and to hate like they hate. What a horrible thing to bring up children in. And we saw the results in David's family. We're going to see it in other families as we go through here. Following God's pattern is important, my friends. Following His pattern is important. Now then, the greatness of this biblical historian of the Kings consists in his firm grasp of the principle that God is the controlling power and sin the disturbing force in the entire history of men and nations. Not just Israel, not just Judah, but of nations. I have a quote here for you. God is the only final public opinion. His opinion is the only one that accounts. And there is another lesson to be learned all the way through these books. In fact, through the entire Bible. The remission of sins does not bring the remission of their consequences. That's right. When we sin in our lives, this has a ripple effect that goes out just not only from us, but to our mates, to our children, to our extended family, to the church. It just keeps going out. And this is true all the way through. And let's say, for instance, if a man has become addicted to alcohol or drugs or something else, and then he repents of this, and he comes to the Lord, and he is forgiven, absolutely forgiven. He's pure and clean before the Lord. But what about the ravages that he's already created in his body? What about the discord? What about the poverty in some cases that he has created in his family? Sometimes the family has already been broken up and there's no way he can put it back together. You see, the effects, they affect it, and the effects then last on and on and on. So we can have remission of the sin, but that doesn't mean remission from the effects of that sin. That is also a very important lesson that we have here. We want to move on into the text itself now. Again, as I said, this is a synoptic. We'll be studying the Chronicles in with the Kings, studying only those separate passages that would bring additional information to us that is different from what we have in Kings. Not different in that they conflict, but add to and give us more information. 1 Kings chapters 1 through 11 cover the reign of Solomon. David's final arrangements and suppression of Adonijah. Here we go again. Problems between children, if you will. Now they're grown-ups, but they've come out of this multiple family, this polygamous situation. And we see now that David's final arrangements has to be made, and we then see the problem between the children. This begins in chapter 1 and goes into chapter 2. The very beginning starts with the failing health of David himself. He's an old man now. He has trouble keeping warmth in his body. He has difficulty all the way around that comes with old age. And so in the first 4 verses we see that they bring him a young maiden by the name of Abishag. She is a Shunammite. And they bring her to David. And as I said, he's in his old age. It was generally felt at this time that the warmth of a young, energetic body would give warmth and a measure of youth to the older person. I don't know why they would think that, but that is something that they thought. Now, Abishag was considered to be David's concubine. He did not have, as we see in the text, any marital relations with her. Now, this is another theory that they had back at this time, especially in Eastern nations, that if the king had lost the ability to have marital relations, he also lost his mental faculties as far as being a man and ruler. This is sad. This is sad. That just simply doesn't happen. The older we get, the more we realize that. Now, Adonijah attempts to seize the kingdom. Again, we see the problem of that upbringing of the polygamous situation. We have one young man wanting the throne that is not to be his. And so we see the rivalry coming up. In fact, I have in the notes just the phrase, shades of Absalom, his brother. Yeah. We see he goes out and he does the very same thing that his brother had done. He sends out heralds and runners ahead of him. He is making a big thing that he is going to be king. He's going to set himself up. And he is spoiled, and he's a handsome young man. And human beings have a way of looking at handsome people and just attributing to them that they have wisdom and that they're smart and they'll be able to do things well and they would not turn upon you. And we look at the surface and make judgments, and we're wrong. And so we see here a handsome young man, a prince, and he wants to be king, and so he's going to gather about him some friends to help him become king. In fact, we see right up front that he has influential friends, friends in high places that are going to help him. The first is Joab. He's general of the army. Joab is general of the army. How about Abiathar? He is the high priest. He has these influential friends. However, David's friends are also Solomon's friends, it will seem, and the faithful. Zadok, the high priest. Benaniah, mighty man of the second class and captain of the bodyguard. He is also faithful. You have Nathan the prophet is faithful. You have Shimei is faithful. We're not sure just who this man is, or Rei. We're not sure about him. But they are faithful. And then the mighty men, 37 in all. These all remain faithful. And we'll also see later on that the runners and the executioners are also faithful. So you have a very strong core here as opposed to Joab and Abiathar on the other hand. You have them, as it were, defecting over to this other prince, not Solomon, but another man. But you have those that are staying faithful to David and to his chosen one, as we'll see, who is Solomon. Also, God's choice in this case. Well, verses 9 and 10, we see there's a coronation feast. Obvious omissions. The faithful are not there. Nathan, the prophet, sees what is happening, and so he goes to Bathsheba, and they have a plan that they want to implement, and this is verses 11 through 37. We see him discuss the plan with her right off, and she is then going to implement the plan. And Nathan carries out his part. What is it? What's this plan? She is to go into the king, and she is to remind him that he has made a promise about Solomon. And then while this is happening, Nathan is to come in at the very same time. And he is going to confirm this by saying, look at what is happening out here at this great coronation feast. And so they're going to cause David, excuse me, to make his decision public. Well, what happens is David confirms definitely his pledge to Bathsheba. Solomon will reign in David's stead. Notice that in this particular instance now, David is showing strength and he is showing mental alertness. He knows what he's doing, and he knows how to transfer power. And so he says, call Bathsheba to me. Well, if we read the text and we think about it, it looks like, well, she was there. In comes Nathan, and he has to call her? That doesn't make sense, unless you understand how this thing worked or how audiences worked. It was the custom that when a king had an audience with his wife or a counselor, no third party was allowed. And so we have at first Bathsheba there. So when Nathan comes in, what would she naturally do? She would leave. She had her private audience. It was interrupted, yes, but Nathan then is entitled to his private audience. And so at this point, when Nathan is through, David says, call Bathsheba, call her back in, is the idea. Now, this is the first time we learn from David he has pledged the throne to anyone. David's solution. He's going to give a solution, and they are going to follow it out. His trusted friends are going to take care of it. He says, go get my mule. Well, the mule is a sign of authority, and the people would recognize David's mule, and so they would see Solomon riding his mule. That means there's some authority here. Is he now the new king? Is this the way it is to be? Then do what? Get the high priest? Yes. Have him anoint him as king. Now, this is not going on over at this celebration dinner, but it is going on with Solomon. And we see that Benaniah's joy comes with a blessing. And what is the blessing that he asks from God on Solomon? Is that his reign will even be greater than his father David's. What a request from the Lord. What a blessing that is. So we see in the verses 38 through 40, Solomon's second anointment. We notice here also that, as I said before, the runners and the executioners are also faithful. There is no reign for Adonijah. Jonathan makes a report of Solomon's appointment, and he names his supporters. But look now, David bows to the new king. Authority is transferred. And when that happened, what happens over at the feast? Everybody leaves. Everybody's gone. All support now for Adonijah leaves. I have a note in here, and this has been true through all history. We've seen it in Russia, we've seen it in the Orient, we've seen it in various places all over the world, that a few select troops can make a change in power in kings or whatever and do it quickly. And it's settled. And if perhaps the whole army had been involved, a different result would have happened. But a few moving quickly can have the change in power. And that's what happened here. We have the few acting upon David's instructions, yes, but the few making the change in power. And what do we see then to those over here that would defect? Oh, we cannot do that. We will just kind of go away from Adonijah. And so the few move quickly, decisively, according to David's instructions, and the transfer of power is taken care of. Well, Adonijah is now not being raised up as king, but has to plead for his life before the true king. This we see in verses 50 through 53. He runs to and grabs a hold of the horns of the altar. Now, the horns of the altar are the sign of strength, the sign of power. In Exodus 21 and 14, this was provided for as a protection to the unintentional manslayer. But there were cities of refuge for this now. This man has no right to go there. Adonijah had no right to claim this refuge. Now, what could Solomon have done? First of all, he could have left him there to starve, or left him on his own and be subject to death. He could have done either one of these things. But what does Adonijah say? He says, I am your servant. He acknowledges Solomon as king. But Solomon is going to forgive him, but it is conditional. And we see David's last words and his prophetic words. This concludes the first chapter. This also concludes the very first session. Read the text. Read ahead. As you see, we're not covering it verse by verse, and so you need to read the text. See you next time.